On August 16, 2018, an article by Lisa Littman of Brown University was published in the journal PLOS One, titled Rapid Onset Gender Dysphoria in Adolescents and Young Adults, a study of parental reports. It looked at data taken from 256 surveys completed by parents recruited from 3 websites, we'll come back to those, where parents had reported rapid onsets of gender dysphoria. Littman's stated purpose for these surveys was to document and explore observations to describe this presentation of gender dysphoria that is supposedly inconsistent with existing research literature. In the background section of the article, Littman expresses concern that current literature on youth gender dysphoria, especially regarding persistence and desistance rates, only included subjects whose gender dysphoria began in childhood, rather than including kids who develop dysphoria in adolescence. She also describes a social and peer contagion that may influence behaviors in adolescence, and although she can't cite studies that link social or peer contagions to transgender identity directly, she cites their role in eating disorders as a mechanism that could influence trans identification, especially thanks to the increase in visibility, social media, and user-generated online content about transgender issues and transition. The methods consisted of a survey given to 256 parents, the vast majority of whom were mothers, collected online via SurveyMonkey. Participants were disqualified if they skipped or answered no to the question about whether the child had a sudden or rapid onset of gender dysphoria, which affected 23 surveys. The survey consisted of basic demographic and baseline characteristics, their kids' exposure to friend groups and internet content, their kids' behaviors, outcomes, and clinical interactions, and their kids' ability to cope with strong or negative emotions. Most notably, the study asked parents to diagnose their adolescent children using an unspecified simplified version of the DSM-5, as well as to do the same for their child when they were younger, based on the parents' recollection. In the qualitative analysis section, Littman attempts to find themes in the reports from parents. She claims themes of the failure and unwillingness in exploring mental health, trauma, or alternative causes of GD, insufficient evaluations, a failure to communicate with their child's medical providers, the misrepresentation of information by the child when they spoke to clinicians, that transition steps were pushed by the clinician, that parent views were discounted or ignored, and that parents had concerns about the clinician's competence, professionalism, or experience. In the discussion section, Littman outlines several factors she believes are present in rapid onset gender dysphoria. She notes the differences in her research, which focused on cluster outbreaks in friendship groups and the suddenness of onset, from previous research, which mostly focused on positive outcomes from transitioning. She also says that the majority of parents were reasonably sure their kids were lying about the history and experiences to their clinicians, including the assertion that adolescents adopt a fake suicide narrative to manipulate parents and doctors into supporting and providing transition services. From all of this, she has 2 emerging hypotheses. One, that social contagion is a key determinant of rapid onset gender dysphoria, and 2, that rapid onset gender dysphoria is a maladaptive coping mechanism for adolescents and young adults. The study was lauded by conservatives and anti-trans activists alike as proof of trans identification spreading like a virus among our children. Breitbart described it as, "Study draws transgender ire, peer pressure, and prior psychiatric illness linked to gender issues in teens." LifeSite News, a conservative Christian website, published an article titled, "Parents Beware, Rapid Onset Gender Dysphoria, a Social Contagion Among Girls." Parents from Mumset, which calls itself the UK's most popular website for parents, saw the study as validation of all their fears of trans rights advocates targeting their children. The American College of Pediatricians, a conservative advocacy group rather than a medical organization, who believe transgender people have a mental illness and believe that it is self-evident that there is a purposeful design to human nature, cited the study when advocating against trans-affirming healthcare. A letter to the actual medical organization, the American Academy of Pediatrics, from an online group of parents of trans kids, supposedly with over 1,000 members, begged them to reconsider their affirmation-oriented approach and cited Littman's study as proof of their kids being victims of a social contagion. This letter really got my attention. Here's how Littman's article was presented. A recent groundbreaking study of an emergent late-onset, predominantly female trans-identifying patient population finds significant parallels with the phenomenon of eating disorders and includes social contagion as a key factor. And it doesn't. This study doesn't find proof of anything. It was, from the beginning, an attempt to mine for data to get a specific outcome. Not only does this study not say what conservative and anti-trans sources say it says, this study doesn't prove what it sets out to say. We're going to dive deep into the Lisa Littman article in Plus One, the waves it caused in public discourse, and why a baseline understanding of the scientific method is vital in stopping the spread of misinformation that bolsters bigotry. A huge thank you to Economy Breakfast for the massive amount of research he did for me for this video. This would not have been possible without him. Part 1. Poisoning the Well. So in my social science video, I talk about validity and reliability as it pertains to scientific research. Something I didn't talk about is applicability. In the case of surveys like this one, what population could the results apply to? You may have heard the term representative sample before, and you might correctly guess that representative is contextual. Representative of who? For example, if you wanted accurate polling data prior to a national election, you'd want a sample population that closely matched the national one. If you only sampled from a single large city or exclusively from rural areas, you'd introduce something called selection bias. This happens more often and is harder to avoid in studies on people than you might think. Recruiting participants for a study is a tough task to begin with, and getting the perfect representative sample is even tougher. If you wanted to study how anxiety affects college students, and your flyer said as much, you might disproportionately draw students with high levels of anxiety because they're going to be the ones most interested in responding. You may not get enough students with low levels of anxiety or no anxiety at all for any results you find to be applicable to college students as a whole. That doesn't mean your data is worthless. You just have to be upfront with the limitations of your study and stress that while your data can apply to students with high levels of anxiety in similar schools to the one you recruited from in similar situations, it may not apply as well to the broader student population. Or, if you're unlucky enough for the media to get a hold of your study, they may twist it to say, college students are mentally weaker than ever, or college is destroying our kids. In the case of the Littman study, we saw many websites of a certain political bias, jumping on the results and using them to make sweeping statements about all trans kids. So let's take a look at her recruitment methods and see how representative this sample is. Lisa recruited primarily from 3 sites: Fourth Wave Now, Transgender Trend, and Youth Trans Critical Professionals. Hopefully from the names alone, the gears are starting to turn in your head, but let's take a closer look anyway. The first site, Fourth Wave Now, whose tagline is a community of parents and others questioning the medicalization of gender atypical youth, was started by a mother who has made it her mission to challenge the medical and psychological establishments that are, quote, letting us all down in their rush to diagnose young people as transgender, and offers a place for parents of trans kids to freely voice their opposition to their kids' treatment. While they say they aren't a right-wing organization, they're more than happy to list the American College of Pediatricians, that transphobic conservative advocacy group from earlier, in their resource index, along with, holy shit, so many other blatantly transphobic articles. The parents coming to this website are going to either be looking for reasons to doubt their child's proclaimed gender identity, or they'll be given an unabashedly anti-affirming stance on the subject. Other parents who comment on the site routinely use phrases like falling prey to the trans cult, and calling trans men pale imitations of a male. This is a site dedicated to denying the viability of transitioning for kids, and unfortunately, it's not the only one. Transgender Trend, the second site, is... Wait, do I have to get into this one? It's called Transgender Trend. Can we not just assume that... No, okay, fine. Transgender Trend is, shockingly, a website for parents questioning the trans narrative. They're probably most infamous for their resource pack for schools, which objects to the use of inaccurate labels such as cis, discourages publicly celebrating a transgender child, and describes trans kids as a biologically impossible situation. We'll dive into that guide a little bit more later, but because of this guide and, well, everything else about their site, they were uninvited from the Stonewall Children and Young People Conference for holding well-publicized anti-trans views. They are explicitly anti-affirmational in their approach to trans kids, and, like Fourth Wave Now, any subject recruited through this website has been conditioned by its content to reject their child's trans identity. The last site is privated and requires permission from its owner to access, but the aptly named gendercriticalresources.com describes the site, youthtranscriticalprofessionals.com, as a site founded by a group of professionals skeptical of the trend to diagnose children and adolescents as transgender, and are concerned about setting them down the path toward medical transition. It's listed alongside other sites such as, you guessed it, Fourth Wave Now, On Leaving the Trans Cult, and other content copied from Transgender Trend. Wow. These sites weren't random. They were the basis for this study. The very first words in the purpose section are in online forums, which is clarified in the first sentence of the introduction to mean specifically fourth wave now and transgender trend. And the descriptions from these websites, which blamed dysphoria on things like friend groups and Tumblr, led Littman to come up with the concept of rapid onset gender dysphoria. Yeah, that's not a diagnosis from medical professionals. That came from parents recruited primarily through those sites. We're not getting a representative sample of parents of trans kids. We're getting a representative sample of the type of parent who seeks out information to question their child's gender identity, which is probably why only 2.5% of them think their child is correct in their belief of being transgender. The ad put out for the survey on these sites even specifies that this is for parents who suspect that their child has had sudden or rapid development of gender dysphoria beginning between the ages of 10 and 21. The survey was meant to exclude parents who didn't already buy into the concept of rapid onset gender dysphoria caused primarily by a social contagion. Not only can you not draw any sort of rate that applies to the population as a whole, but her exploratory study only looked at parents who thought their kid had been infected with the trans. Studied scientifically indeed. Part 2. Garbage in, garbage out. If this were the only fault to be had in this study, it'd be enough to invalidate any attempt to apply this to trans kids as a whole. But it isn't. In April of 2019, a grad student in the School of Public Health at Littman's Brown University, R.J. Restar, published Methodological Critique of Littman's Parental Respondents' Account of Rapid Onset Gender Dysphoria in Archives of Sexual Behavior. This is a blistering detailing of the flaws present in Littman's methodology, and I highly recommend you check it out for yourself. As always, there's a link in the description. Here's a brief rundown of what Restar found beyond what I've already touched on. A pathologizing framework and language that treats the phenomenon as tantamount to an infectious disease that runs counter to improving the lives of trans youth. Describing the phenomenon in loaded language a la cluster outbreaks and comparing trans identification to a disorder like anorexia speaks to Littman's convictions going into this study, which manifested in the construction of the methodology she chose. Being trans is not a disease or a mental disorder, and although distress from having gender dysphoria can be immense, any researcher who actually wants to improve the lives of trans kids shouldn't be pathologizing them as Littman does. The study asked parents to diagnose their kids with gender dysphoria using an unknown simplified version of the DSM-5. Littman didn't provide examples of this simplified version, nor did she offer evidence about whether best practice methods for her adaptation were used. Part of the DSM's measurement for gender dysphoria requires an evaluation from a qualified professional with formal training, and she's asking parents to diagnose their kids with an unknown, unvalidated, and dumbed-down criteria. A reliance on unreliable retrospective reports from parents. She cites a study published in the Internet Journal of Epidemiology that details the concerns of recall bias and its potential to lead to the misclassification of related variables. This suggests that parents are less capable of conceptualizing and interpreting their child's emotional and physical experiences in a manner that is conducive to an observational report. A built-in buy-in factor from the parents for the condition Littman is trying to prove. If there was one sentence I wanted you to take away from this video, it would be this one. Participants recruited into a study should never be selected based on a researcher's a priori knowledge of how the results of the paper would appear and confirm their premise. A lack of online security measures against trolls when using online surveys. This one's pretty self-explanatory, but there was no way to know whether or not the people answering those surveys were all unique individuals or if they actually had kids with gender dysphoria. A lack of evidence for the reliability and internal validity of the measures used in the study. With the exception of a deeply flawed usage of the DSM, Littman relied on non-validated measures to support her hypothesis throughout the paper, even when there were already established validated instruments she could have used. And finally, and probably most importantly, a priori biases present in Littman's framing of the study and sampling approach. These critically undermine the quality and validity of the findings of the study and renders it far less reputable than the clinical studies often ignored by the parents, publications, and organizations who latched onto this one. Part 3. In Search of Censorship. Restar wasn't alone. PLOS ONE said it was aware of the reader concerns raised on the study's content and methodology. We take all concerns raised about publication in the journal very seriously and are following up on these per our policy. We will seek further expert assessment on the study's methodology and analyses, and provide a further update once we have completed our assessment and discussions. In addition, Brown University, which had put a news release about the study on its website, replaced it with an open letter from their Dean of Public Health, who said it was the most responsible course of action in light of questions about the research design and data collection. This, of course, led to a reaction to the reaction from people who lauded the original study, as well as new actors concerned with censorship by the activist left. From Fox News, Brown U censors gender dysphoria study, worried that findings might invalidate the perspectives of transgender community. From the Daily Caller, Brown University caves under activist outrage after publishing research suggesting being transgender is a result of peer contagion. From the Federalist, explosive Ivy League study repressed for finding transgender kids may be a social contagion. From the College Fix, Brown U censors study that found gender dysphoria can be caused by social and peer contagion. My personal favorite from the Daily Wire, a Brown University researcher released a study about teens imitating their peers by turning trans. The left went insane, so Brown caved. And finally, from our old pals at Breitbart, Brown University censors gender dysphoria study from website after pressure campaign. This censorship claim was echoed by both Fourth Wave Now and Transgender Trend. The thing is, at no point was the study taken down from the journal in which it was published. It was always free and available to access in its entirety. In an expanded statement from Brown University on September 5, 2018, they state, Brown does not shy away from controversial research. The university's Office of Communications decided to publicize research on Brown's website on rapid onset gender dysphoria, recognizing the topic to be a subject of rigorous debate in the field of study. After the research paper was published in the journal PLOS One, concerns were raised about the paper's research design and methodology by leading academics in the field. These concerns were serious enough that PLOS One announced that it would conduct a post-publication re-review of the article to seek further expert assessment on the study's methodology and analysis. Given the concerns about research design methods, not the controversial nature of the subject, the university decided to stop featuring this news story on its news site. However, the research article is still available on the journal's website and on the author's Researchers at Brown page. The university does not know how long the re-review of the paper will take or what, if any, actions the journal will take. They further emphasized 3 points. 1. This is not about academic freedom. 2. This is about academic standards. And 3. Academic freedom and inclusion are not mutually exclusive. And the study was eventually republished with changes after the review on March 16th of 2019. Transgender Trend rejoiced in the fact that the results section was basically unchanged, but there were changes to almost everything else. PLOS One published a notice of republication detailing the post-review updates, clarifications, and information. The key change was an increased emphasis that this is a study of parental observations, which serves to develop hypotheses, which, based on the conservative news sites we saw from earlier, was basically missed by everyone with an agenda. Let's look at those headlines again. Not one of them has the word parent in it, even though they were the subjects in the study, not their kids. To be fair, the articles do mention that the study consisted of parent-completed surveys, but given the fact that very few people finish articles, and there's almost no correlation between the amount you've read and whether or not you share it around, a huge number of people got the wrong idea from this study, hence the necessary clarification. The title was changed from Rapid Onset Gender Dysphoria in Adolescents and Young Adults, a study of parental reports, to Parent Reports of Adolescents and Young Adults Perceived to Show Signs of a Rapid Onset of Gender Dysphoria. It seems small, but it reflects the added emphasis that this was parents who perceived a phenomenon, which is not how it was framed originally. And echoing concerns alluded to earlier, they updated the section about recruitment. Before, it was just a short list in parentheses. Now, it gives an entire explanatory paragraph for each, where they admit, however lightly, to the bias inherent in the sites. It's like I knew! They also found out that the survey had been posted to a pro-gender affirming Facebook group that they didn't include or apparently know about the first time the study was published. So they threw that one in too. We can only speculate as to why, but this would be a good time to remind you of the 23 surveys that were thrown out because the parents did not perceive their child to have a rapid onset of gender dysphoria. Along with a notice of republication, PLOS One also released a formal comment on the study that mirrored the concerns of the corrections and emphasized the need for young people to be involved in the studies that affect them, rather than just relying on what their parents say. They cite this meta-analysis published in Quality of Life Research in 2001 that showed a low correlation between parents and children's self-evaluations in several domains of mental health. They also cite this study from the Journal of the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, showing that that's especially true in the assessment of children's anxiety, as well as this one from Psychological Bulletins showing parental attribution bias in the recollection of children's medical history, all of which have huge implications for the questions in Littman's survey. Part 4. Connections. So to recap, Lisa Littman got an idea from reading forums of parents who don't want their kid to transition, recruited from those forums to maximize bias in her favor, asked leading questions to make sure she got the results she wanted, and watched as right-wing sites and concerned parents took her results to mean that there was an explosion in this thing she made up. From the beginning, she knew who was going to latch onto her study and what message they were going to take from it. In fact, all of these sites know that objectively transphobic bigots are going to latch onto the resources they give. That's why Littman tries to play defense for these parents. Towards the beginning of her survey, Littman includes 4 questions. 9. Do you strongly favor, oppose, or strongly oppose allowing gay and lesbian couples to marry legally? 10. More gay and lesbian couples are raising children. Which of the following statements best reflects your opinion? 11. Do you believe that transgender people deserve the same rights and protections as other individuals in your country? 12. Would you support or oppose a law to protect transgender people from discrimination in employment and housing? Littman wanted you to know that her respondents mostly approve of gay marriage because she wanted to help ward off accusations of transphobia going into the study. If you didn't instantly catch the flaw in that line of reasoning, consider the fact that protecting lesbians by denouncing trans women is a defining characteristic of trans-exclusionary radical feminists. But even TERFs would answer yes to a question as vague and vacuous as, do you believe trans people deserve the same rights as everyone else? Interestingly, Littman didn't include the answers to either of these 2 questions in her final paper. Maybe they didn't say what she needed them to. Both Fourth Wave Now and Transgender Trend go out of their way to let you know that they are mostly left-leaning and liberal, despite their movement transcending politics. They want you to know that they really do support trans people, they just think that their kid isn't really trans, and instead they're just being coerced by their peers into thinking there's something they're not. And now their fears have been validated by this amazing new study. And so, of course, Littman comes up as a primary source in Transgender Trend's school resource pack. The title gives away their goal. Kids can't be trans. They can only think they're trans. Despite stating that training should be objective and not evangelical in approach, they're more than comfortable lying about the presence of any evidence that validates an affirmative approach to trans kids, some of which I've put up on the screen now. The only online groups for parents recommended are the same non-affirming sites we've been going over this entire video. They explicitly call thinking that your authentic self is different than the body you were born with is a sign of mental ill health. The only case studies they include are detransitioners. They say that cis is associated with conformity in youth culture, while trans is edgy and cool. They include a statement from the openly transphobic Lesbian Alliance. And I thought this one was the funniest. Their listed source for ROGD being a social contagion isn't even the Littman study. It's not a study at all. It's an essay from Lisa Marciano that treats transitioning like something to be avoided and, again, only includes comments from detransitioners and parents from sites like Fourth Wave Now. It also brings up the Sweden study and misuses it in the same way I went over in my first trans video. Alright, the study looked at 324 sex-reassigned persons from 1973 to 2003. And the same article from Jesse Singal. An article by Jesse Singal. What's missing from the conversation about transgender kids? Let's go back to the resource guide from Transgender Trend. There's the sexology.org link from James Cantor, the one who couldn't do math. Half of these studies are not on the thing your source claims they are. Half of them have dog shit methods with tiny sample sizes, and 64%, that's 7 out of 11, by the way, that's how that works, were conducted at a time when less than half of Americans thought consensual gay relationships should be legal. The guy who compiled this list, and the one you're getting that 60 to 90% statistic from, didn't read the studies he... During our research for this video, a lot of familiar names kept coming up. We found another guide for parents called the Gender Resource Guide that references both the Littman study and the Transgender Trend Guide. It lists the James Cantor studies from sexology.org as proof of desistance, even though it doesn't give him credit for them. Guess what else? We see the Sweden study again. This time, the language sounded eerily familiar to me. According to Ryan, PhD heritage man, the study which, quote, extending over 30 years and conducted in Sweden, where the culture is strongly supportive of the transgendered, documents their lifelong mental unrest. 10 to 15 years after surgical reassignment, the suicide rate of those who had undergone sex reassignment surgery rose to 20 times that of their comparable peers. So I Control F'd, and yep, sure enough, Ryan Anderson's transphobic book, When Harry Became Sally, shows up as a reference. Twice. Not only that, but the very conservative Heritage Foundation is one of the supporting organizations of the guide, alongside the Family Policy Alliance, a conservative Christian ministry, the Women's Liberation Front, a TERF organization similar to Lesbian Alliance from earlier, the Kelsey Coalition, a pro-conversion therapy organization, and parents of ROGD kids, who owe Lisa Littman a debt of gratitude. Speaking of gratitude, in the acknowledgments of her study, Littman thanks Lisa Marciano, the author of that essay from earlier, for feedback on earlier versions of her manuscript. Marciano's Twitter feed is a monument to anti-affirming rhetoric, including retweeting support for the LGB Alliance, an organization who decided that we needed to drop the T from LGBT. Her focus as a licensed clinical social worker seems to center around convincing parents not to let their children transition. She's a member of the GD Working Group, a discussion space for professionals who believe in the social contagion theory of gender dysphoria and who, of course, are concerned with the current trend to affirm them. This group includes Ray Blanchard, the psychologist behind the outdated and debunked belief that trans women are either gay men who just want to have sex with more men, or fetishists, turned on by the idea of being a woman. Also, Kenneth Zucker, a psychologist with extensive research on trans kids who endorses a discouragement model, and James Cantor, who can't read studies. Marciano has also written for Fourth Wave Now, where she rejects the identity model, says that gender dysphoria in kids is most likely to be caused by social contagion, trauma, or sources other than being genuinely trans. She paraphrases Ray Blanchard when saying that it's better to have a well-adjusted lesbian rather than a trans man, and cites James Cantor to infer that trans kids are really just confused homosexuals. This is who Littman wanted reading her transcript for feedback. Marciano has also stated that the idea that what we're supposed to do as therapists is to affirm? That's not my job. If I work with someone who's really suicidal because his wife left him, I don't call his wife up and say, hey, you've got to come back. We don't treat suicide by giving people exactly what they want. This was quoted in a Wall Street Journal opinion piece by Abigail Schreier titled, When Your Daughter Defies Biology. The piece is about the burden of mothers whose children suffer from rapid onset gender dysphoria, and is best summed up by these two sentences. They are terrified their daughters will discover the depth of their descent and cut them off. They are determined to use whatever influence they have left to halt their daughter's next voluntary disfigurement. I did not edit that, by the way. That second sentence really does follow the first one. Schreier's article, of course, quotes Lisa Littman and the faulty claims of social contagion that come with her, which, ironically, infect her piece so that you get the impression that the only reason the college-age trans man in the framing story came out was because he watched too many YouTube videos. ROGD is treated like a real diagnosis, buying wholesale the comparisons to eating disorders that Littman made in her paper. Schreier does this to justify the parents' refusal to accept their kids as trans. The title is echoed in the last sentence. As ROGD daughters rage against the biology they hope to defy, their mothers bear its burden, evincing its maternal instinct, their stubborn refusal to abandon their young. One of the mothers who spoke on the record said that ROGD teens often come from politically progressive families who support gay marriage and welcomed their lesbian daughters, but begged them to reconsider when they suddenly decided that they were actually men. That mother was a spokeswoman for Fourth Wave Now. Abigail Schreier recently appeared on the Candace Owens Show to discuss her upcoming book on adolescent gender dysphoria titled Irreversible Damage: The Transgender Craze Seducing Our Daughters. Conclusion. That Wall Street Journal article, the organizations we've repeatedly encountered, and even the supposedly academic research paper from Littman are all part of this small, incestuous cabal of allegedly progressive feminists whose number one priority is stoking fear in the public, especially parents, about the trans agenda. Their talking points are clear. It's you, the parent, who are the victim if you don't want your kid to be trans. They've turned society against you. The doctors and therapists and psychologists are liars when they tell you transitioning is the way to go. They're either incompetent or they've been infiltrated by them. You can't trust your kid. They've been corrupted by the internet and instructed to lie by them. It doesn't matter how many studies come out showing good outcomes for transitioning, or how many reputable medical organizations endorse best clinical practices, or how sincerely their child pleads with them to accept them as they are. Some parents, yes, even those who support gay marriage, just don't want a trans kid. And so when their kid comes out as trans, they'll search everywhere, believe anything that gives them a reason not to listen. Thanks to the internet, these scared, incredulous parents can find each other and form groups to swap theories about who tricked their child into believing something so heinous. Along the way, these self-described progressive parents are more than happy to get and give support from right-wing family values groups and news outlets, and watch as their stories provide kindling to the burning hatred of an already marginalized community. Lisa Littman has plans to do more studies. She has shown that she is willing to select participants in order to get her preferred outcome, and her future research should be heavily scrutinized for the enormously flawed methodology and interpretations we've seen from this study. The good news is that right-wingers and transphobes jumped on Littman's study because it's all the science they have. That's why they have to resort to using the same handful of debunked sources over and over again. As long as they do, I get to keep saying this. They think trans people are gross, but since their entire position is dismissing the feelings of trans people, they have to pretend that facts are on their side. So they take the worst numbers and lines they can find from the same handful of studies and somehow still manage to lie about them. Stand alongside our trans comrades and be ready to meet them head on. This G is with the T. I hope you'll join me. Thank you so much to my patrons Only Slightly, Red Venture, Wait, I'm Curious, Utah Outcasts, and Sam for helping me out with this video. It really means a lot to me. If you want to help me push back on bad science against trans people or anyone else, or just help me afford to do things in my life, my Patreon link is at the top of the video description. So, only donate if you can, and otherwise I will keep making videos because I really enjoy it. So, thank you for watching.